everybody. Welcome to the webinar today. It looks like we've got quite a few people and probably still some others joining in the room. So as they are coming in, I know everyone has a lot on their minds and on their plates right now. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We hope you get to have a little bit of fun while working, and that was our intent with this event. So our team has prepared a presentation that we hope you'll find very useful. We'll be getting started here in just a moment, but first I want to call your attention to a couple of things. First, you should all have a Zoom dashboard at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the webinar. We ask that you use the Q&A section, please. And our presentation today should run roughly 45 minutes, and we'll follow that up with about a 15-minute Q&A session. If you have specific questions about your organization, we're happy to take those conversations offline separately as well. So also a quick overview about Focal Point. Focal Point is a leading cybersecurity services provider. We work with many of the Fortune 500 and different government agencies, multiple industries and verticals. So we integrate market-leading consulting, technology integration, and cyber workforce development services to provide end-to-end solutions for security leaders looking to future-proof their companies against threats, changing data protection laws, and growing workforce shortages. You can learn more about our services, our solutions, and our team at focalpoint.com, focal-point.com. So feel free to check us out if you have not already. Also, by checking us out, you'll get more entries to win a Peloton at the end of this. So definitely we recommend that you go download our white papers and things so you have more chances to win. And third, we could not have done this webinar today without our amazing partners. We have SecZetta and Ping with us today. So I will let first up Kate Graham from SecZetta do a quick introduction to her company.
Thanks, Courtney. Yes, thank you all for joining. This has been a really fun event to plan. As you know, as you can tell, Courtney and I and Stephanie are all in matching. Well, we are in matching t-shirts. You know, it's hard to see, but yes. So SecZetta, we help to automate the onboarding process for all of your non-employee identities. So we facilitate that onboarding process so that the lines of business are all involved in the decision making around that person's identity, who the sponsors associated with that person, and then ultimately we're able to connect directly to downstream systems like Ping for the type of access that these identities might need. So we help to ensure the life cycle of these identities is actually managed, and therefore we take into account the risk that they truly do pose to your organization. And I think at this point, I'm going to pass things over to Matthew from Ping.
Yeah, Matthew from Ping. Thanks everybody for joining. I was going to throw some jokes into my overview of who Ping is, but my wife reminded me I'm not funny. So you get the standard pitch. You'll notice that we're supported by our chief identity champion over my shoulder, who looks very similar to Terry Crews. We appreciate everyone joining and hope that you either learn something new, and if you don't, maybe you win something exciting, but hopefully both. Ping, a little bit about Ping. We provide cloud identity solutions for employees and your customers. We got the standard stuff, Magic Quadrant leader, 60% of the Fortune 100, 80% of the headaches. Chick-fil-A, Raising Cane's, or ordered from Gap or a number of other businesses. You've worked with Ping and you don't even know it.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, I want to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Stephanie Hagopian. She's the SVP of Business Development here at Focal Point. Stephanie oversees global sales and business development initiatives for Focal Point. She leads our go-to-market efforts and assists with the strategic direction of the company. She leads my team of business development reps and solutions engineers as they work with security leaders on challenges related to identity governance and access management, cybersecurity and data policy, and integrated risk management and cybersecurity workforce development. She has over 15 years of IAM related experience, and some of that is firsthand delivery and advisory experience across every industry and vertical. Internally, we call her the identity queen. So without further ado, the identity queen herself, Stephanie Hagopian.
Wow, that's quite the intro. Thanks, Court.
Yes.
And thanks, Courtney already said it, but thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules. I'm sure some of you dialed in just to see how we were going to pull this off on a Peloton bike. Here it is. I get it. It's been a long, long pandemic, but hopefully the content here will keep you around for the full hour. Not just because we've loaded this deck with a bunch of fun fitness analogies, which we have, but we've also structured today's session with the intent of providing you with practical ways to attain maturity within your IAM program, no matter how long you've been in the industry and how aspirational your goals might be from an IAM perspective. If you don't mind forwarding it to the next slide, let's get started. So what you see before you is our kitschy IAM maturity scale, but I promise you it's not just focal points perspective of identity and access management maturity. This actually comes from industry recognized control frameworks like NIST and ISO, as well as from analyst-based predictive models like Gartner or Forrester. And as you're all aware, we did ask some of you to fill out a short survey. We did get some responses where all of you tended to, you self-scored yourself around your IAM fitness level. And for the folks who did fill it out, we got a really wide array of responses. Most think they reside somewhere in that middle tier, but it's kind of a trick question since your fitness depends on the metrics you're using to judge your IAM maturity level and what IT controls are most relevant to your particular organization. I threw out NIST, ISO, there's ISACA, there's a whole slew of them, and every single institution is different. Every single vertical tends to align to different controls as well as different compliance regulations. So everyone kind of answers this question in a different way. It became more apparent as I read through a response regarding which innovative technologies excite you the most or align the most to your IAM program goals. For some, it was really foundational type of stuff, and I'm not saying that as a negative thing, it was just foundational identity management, basic birthright provisioning, more automation of day one access, role-based access controls. Those concepts have been around for 15 years, 10 to 15 years. For others, we got responses like incorporating AI or automation tooling like RPAs, robotic process automation, and integrating those concepts into your existing identity and access management infrastructure architecture, which is closer to what you see on the far right of your screen on the fitness scale. But what was universal is no one put themselves at a 10, which makes sense because the IAM market is ever evolving. And it's also why all of us on this call have some level of job security. But most organizations are trying to, at least from what we've seen at Focal Point, even through our partners, Ping and Sixetta, they've seen the same thing, that folks are still very much focused on attaining baseline controls and still trying to attack the more innovative aspects of IAM, but not immediately. So yes, from an innovation standpoint, new technology is emerging. So you look towards the left, that's what everybody's curious about. That's things like global authentication mechanisms, more modern day authentication protocols like OAuth or OpenID Connect, OIDC, identity proofing, passwordless authentication, broader controls that encompass RPAs, controlling non-human identities, AI-based risk profiling is a big one, and things that are driven by global compliance initiatives. Like anyone who knows anything about GDPR is trying to probably start thinking about things like self-sovereign identity. But in reality, most organizations we work with are either still too entrenched with more traditional or legacy IAM platforms that it's been slow going to untangle that legacy footprint and even touch on those new features that I just mentioned, or more generally speaking, the foundational identity and access management wins, like that basic user lifecycle management stuff, it's still your core business driver because the legacy technology really never worked in the first place, never really got working the way you wanted it to. But in almost all cases, the organizations we work with have application lists in the hundreds that represent the stack they still want to integrate into their IAM infrastructure. So even if core functionality is in place for you, like governance, user lifecycle management, single sign-on, MFA, even PAM is all deployed, it's really partially deployed because you haven't integrated it with everything, and there's still stuff that lays outside the purview of that environment. It's not being regulated by that infrastructure. So in short, even though my explanation is anything but short, most folks are what I would say, I would put it as lightly jogging your way to identity fitness with the aspiration to integrate your core IAM components, like I just mentioned, together, like incorporating PAM and MFA, or multi-factor authentication by way of example, as well as integrating that IAM foundation with your key business platforms, like your GRC platforms, so that you could apply broader SOD controls. Maybe your SIM solution, so you can get better visibility into what's happening across the entire enterprise from a security perspective. But you're also hoping to broaden the scope of that IAM coverage model so you can encompass more targets that are challenging to manage, like unstructured data, devices, and cloud shadow IT infrastructure, which a lot of folks are talking about. Just today, by way of example, I read about a hack that occurred around video surveillance systems. Video surveillance systems tied into healthcare facilities, and the origin rooted back to, I'm sure everyone's guessed it, credential management, so IAM. Next slide, please. All right. So what you're doing functionality-wise with your technology, which is what I just kind of described on that fitness scale, is only one piece of the pie, which is a bad analogy to use on a fitness webinar, but it is a kind of a three-pronged thing. So you have to look at your IAM program kind of from three separate perspectives. People talk about that one in the upper left all the time. People, process, technology, it's kind of that triumvirate everyone always speaks of when they talk about identity management. It's the cornerstone to an initiative. And that's what we like to focus on. But there's two other crucial elements that we find most organizations we work with tend to initially overlook and find later that they wish they had not overlooked. One of which are KPIs, or key performance indicators. I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a second. And the other is your level of business engagement. They're the most often overlooked, and I would argue that they're most important elements of an IAM program in order to drive actual program adoption and also to justify the existence of your IAM program itself. So we'll talk about business engagement kind of all throughout this presentation, to be honest, but I want to hone in on the KPIs. But I'm going to do, because not all of you filled out that questionnaire, we're doing a few little spot poll things today so that you can continue to pay attention to this presentation, honestly. So the first one is, what in your mind is your single most important key performance indicator within your particular IAM program? Hopefully it fits one of these multiple choice options, which unfortunately was the only way we could present this question, but we're curious to know what you guys would think. And while you're responding, I'm gonna talk a little bit about KPIs. So KPIs measure the success, literally measure the success of your initiative. It's important to do this because it provides executive visibility ultimately into your program. And usually KPIs align to critical use cases as well as to a published guideline. Like I mentioned, NIST or ISO, those are the most typical. So you can look at the NIST control model and kind of map your key KPIs against it. But it's important to do that at the very beginning of your program, or if you're already well into it, then kind of go back and look at it under this lens so that you can prioritize and execute against your program goals and then track your KPIs consistently. So you, A, provide transparency to leadership, and I think even more importantly, you're able to report and actually measure improvement over your IAM program over time, which really just, it gives you money, it gives you budget. So I see we have a response. Court, do you mind telling me what was the most common answer?
The most common answer was reduced risk of potential breaches at 41%.
There you go. That's not too shocking. I mean, I almost feel like the real answer is all the above, but it's like, what's the most painful thing for you right now? And breaches isn't too shocking. I just mentioned the video surveillance hack, and that is the thing that's worrying a lot of people, and breaches are on the rise. So that's interesting. We can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you everyone for responding. So now we're going to talk about how you actually go about achieving identity fitness, how to prevent those breaches, as well as do a lot of other good stuff too as part of your program. Next slide, please. Here's the first of many cheesy analogies. So this is better than some of the terms I'm sure you're sick of hearing. We've got digital transformation. We hear about zero trust all the time. If you're in this field, identity and access management, you probably hear identity is the new perimeter, or identity is the center of everything. But I have a new one for you. Identity resides at the core of your business and your cybersecurity model. So it's totally cliche and cheesy. I know these are overused phrases, but I think it's capturing two really essential things. From a defensive standpoint, the human vector is still the most heavily targeted by threat actors. People are the target for phishing attacks. By way of example, phishing attacks are the most common attack mechanism, right? And we all kind of know that. But then from a defensive standpoint, managing a digital identity is truly the best way to safeguard your organization, because it's one of those rare mitigating controls that reaches its tentacles into everything, no matter what you're doing or where you're doing your work and what resources you might be accessing, or really your constituents, your end users may be accessing. Because it's so all-encompassing, IAM can and really should operate as a joining force for the three bubbles you see around it: HRIS, IT, and your business. These three parts of the org don't talk organically with each other half the time, but identity management forces that collaboration and coordination, both from a tactical perspective, meaning as part of your technology deployment, if you're doing any IAM anything, you're going to have to bring in those stakeholders, but also by way of what you're trying to do from a business process perspective as well. Next slide, please. So what's your talk track? At the end of the day, you can buy any stationary bike and you can work out on it. But why Peloton does so well is because it's not really about the bike. It's about the culture around the bike. It's why people are willing to spend twice as much on this bike versus other bikes. They want to be part of the Peloton community. Peloton has done an excellent job of building its brand. And honestly, that's what you have to do as well to be a successful steward for your IAM program. You may not want it. You may not want to hear this, but you're more of a salesperson than you think, because you have to evangelize your IAM initiative every single day. Communications planning ends up being super, super critical no matter what you're doing for identity and access. So you end up building this cultural awareness of your initiative across all these various stakeholder groups. And the only way to really do it and make people care about it is to tie it back to them. Peloton does a really good job of that too. This is why you have to sell your IAM program as a business enabler and not as an IT project. You must talk about tangible, direct business outcomes, i.e. those KPIs I talked about, because that's what entices your stakeholder community. Tangible example, you talk to the service desk, they're not going to care how your initiative is going to help you achieve SOX compliance, even though that's what you care about. What they do care about is how you're going to simplify password management or that user sign-in process, so let's call them in the first place. Let's talk about IAM. If you have a customer-facing IAM initiative, the e-commerce group is probably going to push back a lot on just the concept of having a security layer complicating their consumer initiative. But what they're going to love is how your project will actually increase customer retention and loyalty, because you're going to make it easier for them to engage within your consumer portal. People don't talk about that when they talk about identity management. They're focused on the authentication aspect, which is super important. But when you make authentication easy, people stick around. So although you might maybe even consider yourself to be an introvert, I hate to say this, but IAM is, you have to be a salesperson when you're an IAM leader in an organization. I would argue you also have to be a marketing guru and probably a politician all in one. Next slide, please. Cross fitness is key. I've been hinting at this one in the past two slides, but the rub is that you must rope in every single major player within your enterprise to make your program successful. I've seen a lot of companies not succeed, and they've come to us and said it's been stops and starts all the way through because they tended to do IAM programs in a silo or a bubble, which is dangerous because you are really impacting everybody in your org. You're impacting HRIS, IT, network engineering team, your finance systems, compliance, legal audit, service desk, critical app owners, pretty much every single line of business. I've seen projects come to screeching halts because the stakeholder was brought in at the very end and they stopped the deployment because it didn't meet their existing business processes. It didn't meet their requirements. No one asked them what their requirements were, and they didn't want to change their existing business process because they were never part of the conversation. So the whole thing got put on hold, go live dates got pushed out, nightmare. So I'm going to pose another question. Which part of the business in your mind is the most challenging for you guys to onboard within your IAM program? If you've already started an IAM initiative of some sort, what historically has been the most challenging? And while you answer that, I'll talk a little bit about that last bullet point. There's an IDSA white paper. For those who aren't familiar, IDSA is the Identity Defined Security Alliance. They're an amazing consortium of not just vendors, and in fact, all three of your sponsors on this webinar are members of IDSA, Ping, Sixetta, and ourselves, Focal Point. And there's also organizations like yourself, there are big financial logos on there that all participate to try to create a global standard architecture for identity and access management, like actual protocols and standards and best practices. And they just released a white paper that, frankly, is a white paper that should have come out years ago. And it's a research paper where they interviewed a bunch of stakeholder groups outside of IS and asked them what they looked for in an identity and access management program. It's a really, really good white paper. It shows their needs, their priorities. It will give you some good insight into how to kind of sell your program to those outside of information security. What was the response?
So by 35%, everyone chose engineering, infrastructure, and networking teams.
So by everyone I've talked to before this webinar said the exact same thing. And we're going to talk through this presentation on exactly how you talk to those particular stakeholder groups. I will tell you that white paper I just mentioned, I think we're going to post the link in the actual chat window. And if not, we'll send you guys, you can always Google it too. But they do tackle that piece of it as well. They do talk about, your IT, your infrastructure teams, and how you really rope them in. And certain programs or parts of your IAM program, it's more difficult. Like very simple use cases, privileged access, your DBAs hate it. If you're going to lock down the keys to the kingdom, people aren't going to like it in IT, and that always tends to be a struggle as well. Not a shocking answer, but interesting. Next slide, please. So be flexible. As much as we know better than them, and by them, I mean our end users, they have to be on our side. And we have to be open-minded and very flexible towards the needs of the business. End users, we love them. They buy AWS tenants to do their DevOps stuff. They write their passwords on sticky notes still. They click on phishing emails, like I talked about earlier. They get really pissed off when they have to reset their passwords. They're very vocal when they are displeased about what we're doing. And more often than not, they probably don't like your team and what you're doing for the company. But in turn, we, IAM people, get frustrated by the end users all the time because they make this job very difficult. And unfortunately, even though they make the job difficult, they're definitely your clients at the end of the day. And even though, we cringe at how hard it is to sometimes meet those business requirements from a security perspective, it's always been, for years, the paradigm of usability versus security, right? It's always a scale, and you have to meet in the middle. So what's so great about identity management, how it's matured even in recent years, is that a lot of these technologies will assist in increasing efficiency and ease of use while you roll out your policies, your processes, and solutions. And it's gonna, at the end of the day, really enable your end users, but it all goes back to communication. You have to communicate that what you're doing from an IAM perspective is actually going to help them and not hurt them. Next slide, please. So to make your end users more pliable to what you're doing, which is kind of converse of what I was saying in the last slide, is to think of yourself as a coach. Coaches lead by example. So you really have to be your own sponsor of your IAM program. So it's not just about you. I think, all of InfoSec really has to apply the same policies, processes, and best practices you want to employ across the entire enterprise. You've got to evangelize your objectives to the rest of the organization by leading by example. Like I said earlier, you guys sell it. So this is why IS is typically used to have their pilot community. I see it all the time. When you do something like governance, a lot of times IS or IT ends up being your pilot community because they kind of have to be your guinea pigs, but they're also stewards for your program. That practice what you preach adage goes really, really far under this paradigm. Next slide, please. So I think one of the hardest things to realize when you're embarking on an IAM initiative is the fact that there's not going to have a clean start and end to it. This is my favorite slide. This was the slide I started with when I was thinking about fitness analogies because it's so incredibly accurate. Once you begin your identity journey, you, upside, have job security. Downside, you are never allowed to retire. This is a marathon. Really, it's an ultra marathon. Even more challenging is the fact that when you reach mile 20, you may be expected to sprint to mile 26 and probably follow a completely different course than from where you started, with unexpected hills and all sorts of pitfalls that come in your way, maybe no water, which sounds exhausting, probably life-threatening. But there's inevitably going to be moments when you have to completely reprioritize what you're doing within your program, pivot, and rush ahead against new deadlines and new objectives. This sounds absolutely horrible. Honestly, when you know going into it that this is inevitably going to happen, it allows you to better prepare your program for agility, for being nimble, and for being flexible, like that previous slide said. So when you build your IAM architecture out, or even when you're defining those KPIs I was talking about, you do it with the understanding that things are definitely going to change, whether you want it to or not. And that's okay as long as you're prepared for it. And you've essentially built up enough endurance that when it happens, you aren't caught without a backup plan. Frequently, this creates an impetus to build your IAM program as a service catalog for your business. You've probably heard that before, but I've seen the most successful IAM programs follow that model, which is you provide services, stakeholders consume those services, and if you're covering all your bases from a functionality standpoint, you should theoretically be able to course correct without too much collateral damage, except maybe your sanity. So quick poll. How long has your IAM program been going on in your organization? When did it start? Just want to know how long this marathon has been going for most folks. Court, what does it say? Too long? Was that an option?
We do not yet have results. One moment, please.
Okay. Okay. Because it's always interesting to me that some organizations still just kind of getting started. It depends on how long you've been around, obviously, or maybe you've just had a long history doing it, but for your organization, you're building from the ground up. Or, well, I see a big long red line, and that's about all I can see from this far.
63% is under 5 years.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So that says a lot. There are a lot of people who are hopefully learning something from this webinar. All right, next slide, please. Training. So how do you build for endurance? How do you build for the marathon that lasts forever? You train. This is my shameless plug for professional services. Just bear with me, it's just one slide. However, when you really think about it, would you train for your marathon without a trainer or some assistance? Would you do anything that requires a specialized skill set without some type of guidance from those who have done it before? There is a clear benefit to rely on people who have been in the trenches and actually survived, because we bring to bear experience, bring to bear lessons learned, and an approach you may not have executed, or you may have done differently if you had just done it in a bubble or kind of independently. Even if you've done identity and access management before, I assume many of you have, will, are, outside guidance inevitably provides you with some insight because it's combined intelligence and experience. Third-party help also provides you with a targeted skill set. And more tactically, it gives you the ability to gain knowledge transfer and training so that your full-time operational and engineering staff is ready to go and you don't have to use your trainer forever. Other good training analogies. No matter how long you train, if you stop exercising, all that good stuff you learned during the training period will go away and you'll be back to square one. I used to run marathons, and now I run 5 miles, 6 miles maybe, and I can't imagine running 26 miles because I stopped training for it. So I'm a perfect example of what happens when you stop training. But you got to keep doing those things that your trainer taught you, assuming your trainer is well qualified. and to make sure you reevaluate your routine regularly. That's what those KPIs do for you. If you end up being way off from your KPI, that's a really good indicator that you need to retrain, right? You need to kind of reevaluate what you're doing to ensure it makes sense and that's providing the value that your organization is really looking for. Next slide, please. So this analogy is kind of a stretch, but I'm really talking about expanding your IAM reach through all of your user communities. Meaning, if you implement a program that is focused on all of your user types, and not just your workforce, not just your consumers, but also your third parties and your non-human digital identities, then you will avoid injuries like data breaches, and everything you implement will ultimately be easier to manage. That's not to say this is a one-size-fits-all thing. There are better solutions for external users versus internal users. Sixdata is a great example of that. Shameless plug for Sixdata, starting now. Their technology specifically solves for managing access appropriately and with the proper risk context to your third-party entities. And Ping, plug for Ping, offers a true enterprise directory solution that can scale up and out that is way more practical for user quantities that you might factor into your B2B or B2C relationships versus your B2E relationships. You know, a lot of folks use AD and no one's going to throw out AD. I get that, but many users many organizations use separate user stores for B2B and B2C access. And Workday may be your HR system for your FTEs or Oracle HCM or something like that, but it's not appropriate or may not be an appropriate source of truth. Typically, it's not for affiliates and partners, folks who aren't on the payroll, brokers, maybe researchers. Either way, it's okay to pair different technology together as long as you're encompassing all of your use cases into those IAM project initiatives and goals. Next slide, please. Stretch it. Stretching definitely helps with this, but overall, you have to temper your lofty IAM program goals with a little bit of reality and practicality. Don't overdo it. We'd love to solve for everything all at once with an unlimited budget, unlimited time, and unlimited resources. But no one I work with has any of those luxuries and probably isn't going to, especially now that we're in a pandemic. So it becomes this game of prioritization, phasing things out, relying on success and high adoption rates and positive feedback from your stakeholders to get to the next big thing on your maturity scale. To do this, you really need to align your program goals to consumable, realistic bodies of work that provide high value, or even if it's technically not high value, at least high visibility for your end users. Prioritizing self-service access is probably the most common one. Will garner positive adoption and feedback, and it's a great near-term goal to get to that talk track I was mentioning earlier, because you're selling something, right? And it also allows you to get the right KPIs in place to fund for your next thing. So sometimes it's really good to start easy. Like I've talked to folks that, you know, we do a lot of IAM strategy type stuff, and we start with easy. Like do stuff that's really easy to implement in your phase one, because then you're going to get the win in the short term, and that's going to get enough juice behind your IAM program that then you can do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I've often told clients to just wait. I'd rather see someone wait a year to do something and plan for it correctly, get all the right people lined up, set the right expectations within the business and to all their key stakeholders, than to just rush a project to launch it before the appropriate buy-in is in place, and then fail at implementing any of it because no one was ready, no one was available, there was some other project that was a higher priority, and no one really understood what was being done. So that's the other side to it. It's like start with the stuff that is somewhat easier to do, but then at the same time, make sure you're ready for anything. I'll give you an example. I once had a project, it was a long time ago, it was almost a decade ago, and it was 100% technically successful. It was a legacy IAM tool deployment, and it was amazing. You know, back then, just to get those heavier solutions in place was a feat in itself. It went live, everything was great, it was performing as expected. We were all so excited and happy and patting ourselves on the back, not just us, the consultants, but also our client. Everybody was very satisfied with how it went until we went to the CIO. CIO thought it was a failure. And the reason he thought it was a failure is he had no visibility into what we were doing. and thought that we were going to solve all his self-service problems and automate everything all at once, all in one shot. And that was not what the project was about. It was a phased approach, and no one had really communicated to him what to expect. And since he expected so much, when we got to him to explain what we had all done, he deemed it a failure, stopped the whole thing, cut the budget, and doesn't matter how technically successful it was, from a business perspective, it was a failure. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Next slide, please. So finally, we're going to talk about diversity. Diversifying your routine is key. I said this before, this is not a marathon, so don't overdo it. Or this is a marathon, the opposite, it is a marathon along with lots of sprinting. So definitely don't overdo it, but make sure that you have that phased program strategy in place that encompasses more than just one aspect of identity and access. Diversifying your functional areas within this program is key to ensuring it's robust enough to really check all the boxes. Integration of different technology functionality builds that fully functional program, right? It seems obvious. What I mean is doing user lifecycle management is great, but you need to integrate that with your authentication and authorization processes and technologies, not just for your standard users, but also thinking about your privileged users and your non-human users, and not just for your FTEs, but also for your third parties, and not just for your internally hosted apps, but also for your SaaS, PaaS, other hosted applications. And as you build and build, integrate all these things with each other, it may take longer to get to the next phase of work if you do it that way. But when you take that approach, it pays off in the end, and it closes a lot of potential gaps that might appear in your program when, oh, wait, you go completely 100% virtual, which happened to a lot of organizations last year. So I'm going to give everyone one more question. Which aspect of IAM do you feel you have the strongest handle on, or that you've addressed the best so far? And really, these questions are more for everyone. You know, I wanted to give everyone visibility into what other people were experiencing, not just us, the third-party consultant, even folks on this call. I think it's really beneficial to find out what the majority of organizations are contending with. While we wait for that, I'll just continue to pedal. All right, what's the result?
Oh,
more than one.
We've got a tie this time at 26% for both password management and user lifecycle management.
All right, okay, password management, I wasn't shocked because it's kind of a fundamental thing. You know, usually most folks have done something around password reset. You know, you can do that pretty easily with AD. I am surprised with user lifecycle management because that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. I'd be curious to know if it's basic, you know, day one user lifecycle management, or if that's like full-blown user lifecycle management for everybody. Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for doing that. And finally, we have one more slide that I wanted to cover, which is an offer from Focal Point. We wanted to give everyone an opportunity to get a fitness score just on a more personal level. So if you, regardless of the bike, which we are going to get a winner, announce the winner, look at who participated the most, I think by the end of today. But outside of the bike, if you just want to engage a little more with us, we are very willing to work with you on just giving you a general sense of where you are from a maturity perspective. That will include a 1-hour discovery session. We've got a questionnaire we want to distribute, and we'll give you a, not just a, like I said at the beginning with the maturity scale, this is not just Focal Point's opinion, this is also based on control frameworks and analyst opinions and published maturity models. We will put you on the scale and let you know what you're up to and provide some recommendations as well. So if you're interested, please email info@focal-point.com. That's the end of my content, but I want to open it up to questions and see if anybody's posted. I think we have, yeah, we've got a little more than 15 minutes for questions.
Steph, I was just going to say, someone's posted in the chat. If you could talk a little bit more about IAM strategy in the healthcare vertical in particular.
Yeah. Oh, I could talk forever about IAM and the healthcare vertical. I don't know if that was placed by someone we know, but we, not just myself, actually, all three sponsors on this in this meeting hosting this webinar, we all do a lot of work with healthcare. And that's because healthcare is so highly regulated. You know, you guys are not just facing SOX, there's HIPAA, HITECH, HITRUST. And from an identity and access management perspective, there's just so much more you have to contend with. So I didn't accidentally talk about 6 other third parties and mention things like affiliates and researchers for no reason. Affiliates, researchers, students, referring physicians, all those user communities that reside outside of full-time workers, vendors, contractors, that is really unique to, I would say, healthcare and higher education would be the two, and higher education and healthcare overlap quite a bit because you have university medical centers. And identity and access management really, it can fundamentally be treated the same way to a certain point, but you just have much more expensive use cases. So this question asked is a real big question. Usually the answer encompasses more than a sentence or two. You know, it's kind of like you gotta look at every single one of your user communities, would be my first thing. You definitely have to contend more with third parties. And the major thing we see the most in healthcare is multiple personas. So you have even your user base is expansive, but then you have a nurse or a physician, a credentialed user who has to access more than one thing in more than one, with more than one persona, right? There, you could have a specialty physician who goes to one clinic to do X, and then they go to another clinic to do Y. So that is another layer of complexity around your identity management program. And the thing I would suggest is you really have to flesh out those multiple personas and what that workflow looks like. You know, how do those people operate within the institution really? And what systems do they touch upon, especially your EMR, like your Epic or your Cerner or whatever, to really do IAM well, to do it comprehensively within your institution, and to keep in mind that's not just your institution, it's the all the collaborative relationships you have, and even relationships you're having in the payer community. And there's a whole, like when you talk about maturity, healthcare, interestingly enough, is becoming a little more, you guys are doing a lot more around the self-sovereign identity piece because of regulations like the 21st Century Cures Act it's forcing you to care. So GDPR means you care if you're part of, you have EU-based users and you're a global organization, so you care for that reason. Healthcare cares because of 21st Century Cures. And what 21st Century Cures is doing is the same thing as GDPR. They're saying your patients need to have self-sovereign ability to take their information from your clinic to another clinic. They should be able to seamlessly access information on the payer side of the house. How do you do that? A lot of it is based on the protocols I talked about at the very beginning. OAuth and OIDC are great authentication protocols for providing that ability for interoperability. And even EMRs like Epic are finally getting a hint. And instead of keeping everything in cache and these databases that no one can read except for other healthcare, HL7, if you're in healthcare, you know the nightmare that is an HL7 protocol or standard, they're finally opening up the kimono. They're using APIs because it's a demand. Like you're going to have more transparency because this is coming. That legislation is moving ahead, and inevitably standards are going to be the way to go. So there's a lot to say about that one question, but it's a big thing. Email us. We'll talk more, but it's a very good question.
If we have some other questions coming in, we have one here that asks, are you seeing continued big shifts from on-prem to hosted to true SaaS IAM tools?
Big time. We are seeing that consistently. There is a movement from on-prem, a lot of on-prem going over to pure SaaS. I still see hybrid mostly because of for regulatory reasons. So I'll take healthcare, certainly one, but since I just talked a whole load about healthcare, I'll use utilities as an example. Utilities companies have critical infrastructure and non-critical infrastructure. I don't think I even have to say why, because the state of Texas just went through it. Courtney knows because she's in Texas. Critical infrastructure, it's really important to segregate it because if it gets hampered with, it sucks and the world shuts down. They will never really be able to go full SaaS, full cloud because it's that critical infrastructure, just like Fed, has so many regulations associated with it. I don't think they'll ever be able to be like all cloud. But most companies, especially financial services, retail, manufacturing, we are personally seeing a lot of folks move to all, you know, in IAM specifically, the solutions are cloud-based solutions, or deploying traditional solutions in their own private tenants. So if, you know, most of the technology is moving in this direction, where even if it's not true multi-tenant SaaS, it's definitely a subscription-based model or a services-based model. And then in addition, they can leverage their own Azure tenant or their own AWS tenant and just deploy it there and be able to take advantage of Dockerization, containerization, and all that good stuff. And it's easier to deploy, it's shorter to deploy. The only caveat here is you give up some of the full-fledged functionality if it's true multi-tenant SaaS, and it's intentional. That's why it's easier to implement and manage. Conversely, all the stuff I just talked about in this presentation is about communication, evangelization. That becomes extremely important when you're not going to do everything for your stakeholders. So you have to take on the onus of going back to all those various constituents and saying, I know you want the use case to look like this because the business process has always been this, but because we're moving to the SaaS model and making everybody's lives easier in the long term, plus side, we're going to implement like 20 more, 100 more applications into this infrastructure because it's a heck of a lot easier. Downside is I can't do exactly what you want me to do. Instead, let's talk about your business process and see what makes sense, because this is what the tool does out of the box. And I really don't want to deviate from what the tool is doing out of the box. And let's follow this paradigm, and maybe something's going to become an exception process, and that's okay. Hopefully that answers the question. What else do we got?
All right, I'm going to combine two for you. So the question is, where do you begin when you're restructuring your IAM for a growing business, and how do you get other business units on board?
The entire presentation, yeah. So where you begin, I'm going to give you such a consultant answer. It's going to really depend on your particular use cases, your particular business needs and priorities when you're building from the ground up. It also depends on your priority. That's why we ask all these questions about priority. Look at your priorities. What is the thing causing you absolutely the most pain within your organization right now? Does it take too long for people to get access to resources when they join the company? Is the service desk overwhelmed with password resets or access requests? Is the authentication process super painful and you want to look at simpler ways of authenticating your user community? Is it this switch to 100% virtual that's killing you? Do you have a impending license renewal with some of the old stuff? Because this person just mentioned rebuilding. So, if it's a rebuild, I'm assuming you probably have legacy something. So maybe look at a lot of times we recommend to organizations, look at that user license renewal. Maybe it's September, and you kind of track against, let's replace that old thing that's costing us a lot of money with the new thing. And that's why we're going to prioritize that first. License savings is a big hitting first goal as well, but it really does, the consultant answer is it depends. It really does depend on you and your organization specifically. And I would say to get to the other stakeholder groups, it's going early and often. So it's having that communications plan in place from the get-go. And I would recommend a couple things. Thing number one, have an IAM steering committee. So if you don't already have one, put one together. I know that sounds blasé. It's actually more involved than just go find some people and create a steering committee. But we can provide you with recommendations. You can look it up online too. There's certain C-level executives that should definitely be involved in those steering committees. And you bring all the leaders from different divisions and different functional areas within your business to participate in that steering committee. And that sets the groundwork for getting the right level of people in your org, top down, involved, engaged, and signing up for your initiative. It's definitely it has to be bottoms up and top down, but the top down is going to be the most influential, because if you can get, I just worked with an organization that's global, and they have, even though they're global, they're decentralized. So they have CIOs specific to each business unit. And the way we started this IAM initiative that's now been launched is last year, about 3 months prior, we started talking to all the individual CIOs and just getting a better sense of what their priorities were and what they wanted, what their requirements were. And we put together this CIO board and kind of pitched to them. And I say we, it was like, yes, Focal Point, but Focal Point plus the CISO was working with us and the head of IAM. And we put together this really nice story as to how we were going to benefit them. We got all of them to sign up for the strategy. And now we're launching the whole strategy, and they're part of the steering committee at the same time. And it's just been a lot easier because we got the top-down buy-in, top level from the get-go, and now they're on our side and they're helping to push it to hard communities like IT engineering and networking. Like they're getting trumps because we have the CIO and the CTO and the CISO all in our corner. So hopefully that helps. What else? Anybody else?
Any other questions? I don't see any more in the Q&A or on the side panel here. All right, well, it looks like that wraps up the Q&A session for this afternoon. If you have additional questions or if there's something that you would like us to answer in more detail or talk through specifically with your organization, feel free to reach out. The email there on the bottom of the screen, info@focal-point.com, or you can also reach out through our websites, whether it's Focal Point, Sexetta, or Ping, you can go directly to our websites. You have until the end of business today to download white papers for additional chances to win the Peloton, or we have a second place prize, which is a Peloton fitness package. I believe, I'm not sure exactly what all that includes, but it definitely includes membership to Peloton, the app on your phone, which is how I started before I bought the bike, even though I mostly sit in front of the bike and not on the bike. It is great. You can use the app with any bike that you have, but they have additional things outside of biking, whether it's running or stretching or meditation or yoga. They've got a lot of different classes. So it's pretty cool.
If you're an IAM professional, you do need a lot of meditation. So I would say it's a really good second prize that like helps you attain your Zen as you contend with what is arguably one of the hardest roles to have in a company. So,
and I don't have
very appropriate gift.
I don't have the bike, and that app is amazing. So
Agreed.
I mean, look, I got the bike. I gotta say, I actually have worked up a sweat during this presentation. So thank you also, everyone, for giving me this nice workout today. I had fun. I hope you all had fun too.
Stephanie, everyone's very impressed, by the way, with your slow pedal through the entire presentation.
I think you're going to receive an Olympic medal for this.
I appreciate it. But thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you participating today. I hope it was informative. And good luck winning that bike. We'll talk to you soon.